Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another Series 2000 book review. And today we're going to be looking at book number 1, Cry of the Cat. Now, off the bat, I've heard a lot of praise about this book ever since I started my channel and got more familiar with Goosebumps as a whole and looking into Series 2000. I see a lot of people putting this book really high on their ranking lists, like in their top 5 consistently. I've even seen people put it at number 1 or even number 2. And after reading this for the first time ever, because as a kid I never got around to reading this for some reason. I don't know. I don't think I was a big fan of cats growing up, so this book really never appealed to me. As a matter of fact, I never watched the episode until I started my channel. And I think that was the last episode I needed to ever watch to complete the show. And that was really early on in my channel, and I'm surprised it's taken me this long to get to the book. But after reading it for the first time and after hearing people's praise for it, I can understand why people put this book high. It's not a personal favorite for me, and I know that might be kind of upsetting for a couple of you watching, hoping that I would really love this. I had a high expectation going into this, especially after watching the episode and thinking that a lot of the stuff from the episode would be kind of in the book. And while it's mostly there, this book does do something different, and the differences are still enjoyable for what it is. Some of the things people had mentioned really hold up, and some things really just didn't match the hype. But I still think this is a really, really exceptional book. I really enjoyed this one, and I can't wait to talk about more of what I think about it near the end of the video. But off the bat, if you have not read Cry of the Cat, this is definitely one where it's worth going online, paying whatever price it costs, and getting it to you to read. Also, a fun fact before we go any further, this book, if you're a fan of the original 62, this book was supposed to be the 63rd book, and it was supposed to be the capstone book to the original series, and then Bride of the Living Dummy was originally supposed to be the first Series 2000 book. But this book had a bunch of rewrites. It has a weird history where this book was like rewritten a bunch of times, and Scholastic couldn't decide on which version they wanted, and then they settled on this when Series 2000 was pretty much, greenlit and underway. And this one became the first book in that series because it was already finished. And yeah, like I said, I see the hype. I see why people love it. I quite love a lot of things about it. It's not a personal favorite, but I definitely recommend it, and you should go pick this up and read this if you have not before. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story starts off with this girl named Allison. And Allison is this girl who, she's like, off the bat, you start off the story with this horror movie montage playing of this horror movie called Cry of the Cat. And it's kind of like a little mini fake out to start the story off. And it's revealed that Allison's younger brother has rented this movie. And he's like 5 years old, and he rent this movie that's too scary for him. And Allison is kind of worried about her little brother, and asks him if he's all right. And little brother's like, "Yeah, I'm okay, but can you finish the movie for me?" And she's like, "Maybe later." She has stuff to do. And it's revealed that Allison is like this thespian middle schooler. She and her best friend Ryan have these pretty important parts to this play. This play is like a musical that their drama teacher has written within like a week. And they're going to rehearsal to practice the lines and the songs and whatnot. And her friend Ryan comes, and she gets on her bike, and they head to school for rehearsal. And on the way there, she wasn't paying attention while riding her bike, and she accidentally runs over this cat. And she thinks she sees that her bike had like decapitated the cat's head, which is pretty graphic. And freaks her out. She falls off of her bike. She bruises her elbow real bad. The bike falls on top of her. She gets hurt pretty bad. And through this bike accident, they're now going to be late for the rehearsal. So when she gets off, she immediately looks over at this limp cat. The cat's head never fell off, and she assumes that this must be the cat that she hit. This cat's like gray, it's limp. She picks it up, It has yellow eyes that are staring blankly. Its purple tongue is hanging out, and she's pretty guilt ridden off the bat. She's feeling guilty that she killed this cat, and her friend Ryan's like, "Oh, it's a dead cat. That's gross." And Allison feels bad, and she wants to find the owner. So she sees nearby this yard where this cat could have come from. So she takes the cat up to this door and knocks on the door, and this girl answers the door. And later on in the story, you find out her name is Crystal, but this girl named Crystal essentially answers the door, and Allison's like, "Hey, I think I might have killed your cat," because she puts two and two together after she sees these cats looking out of the window, and they're all making these really loud, like mewing sounds, like they're mourning the loss of this cat. And Crystal's like, "No, not that cat. No, that's Rip. No, Mom's not gonna like this. No, 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 no." And she's like freaking out and wants Allison to leave. And Allison's like, "Well, what do you mean?" And after she hears about this cat is named Rip, and that Rip's no ordinary cat, according to Crystal, the cat that she's holding comes to life and scurries off. And Allison and Ryan are perplexed, and they try to shake it off, and they head to rehearsal anyway. They head to rehearsal. They're a little bit late, but so is their teacher. And when the teacher comes, the teacher wants everyone to get prepared for rehearsal for what they're doing that day. Now, on this specific rehearsal, they were going to be doing a prop rehearsal, and while they're reenacting the part that they're practicing, Allison thinks she hears a cat's meow that nobody else seems to hear. And then on this little prop thing, she sees Rip, and she freaks out, and people holding the prop freak out because the cat jumps out of nowhere, and then they drop the prop, and it lands on top of the cat, which smushes it. And when they lift the prop up, Allison looks over and says, "That's the same cat from earlier. That must be Rip." And Ryan's like, you know what? That can't be true. There's no reason why that should be Rip. He scurried off. Why would he come to the school? And Allison is like, "No, that's the same cat." And then the cat reanimates, comes back to life, and then scurries off again. And this scars Allison. Everybody's looking at her, thinking that she's weird. Something might be wrong with her. And things get even weirder later that night when she comes home, and she wants to tell her parents about this ordeal with this Rip cat. And her mom has made this soup, and her family's sitting down eating this soup. So is her little brother. And while she's trying to eat the soup, she looks in her soup, and then there's this gray cat hair coming into the soup that she's eating. And she's starting to get kind of worried that something is off, something might be a little wrong here. And later that night, after the whole soup ordeal, she goes into her room, and she has these collection of mice for some reason, like these toy mice, and they all have been scattered on the floor. And she can't help but think that maybe Rip is inside of her house somewhere. So this is where the story gets kind of surreal, gets very mind-gamey. Seems like Rip is stalking Allison for some reason, and Allison doesn't know what to make of it. So she goes to bed, and later the next day, she goes to school, and while she's at school during lunch, she looks inside of her bag, and she swears she sees a decapitated cat head staring up at her. And this shock scare of a scene causes an entire outburst from her in the lunchroom, and everyone seems to stare at her. And of course, her friend Ryan wants to stick up for her and kind of makes nods, saying that, "Oh no, she's just not, don't pay any mind to her." But Allison's like, "No, I'm really telling the truth," but like under her breath to Ryan. And Ryan, being the friend he is, looks inside the bag later on and just sees food in there. So for some reason, Allison's having these weird visions of Rip, and it's starting to get to her. She wants Ryan to understand what she's going through. She keeps explaining it to him, and Ryan is actually one of those supporting characters that seem to understand and believe the protagonist, which is a breath of fresh air to read. Characters like Ryan, you don't find them often in Goosebumps. Later that night, after the whole thing happened, she goes home and she's in her room, and it's a weird night. The window's open, and she's laying in bed, and all of a sudden she feels like she's being suffocated. And she reaches her hands up and she grabs fur, and she's like, it feels like a cat. Turns out Rip's in her room trying to suffocate her to death. She fights Rip, she picks him up, and then right before she's able to get him out of the window, Rip scratches her, and she throws him across the room, and he flies out this open window and lands in her yard, and she looks out the window and sees that Rip's laying there lifeless, and then she kind of sees him reanimates and scurries off, and then she checks her scratch, immediately looking for blood, but there's no blood. It's a complete bloodless scratch, and it's like glowing white almost, and this is really weird to her. She doesn't know what to make of it, but it gets weird. So she goes to bed, and later that day she's at school again at rehearsal, and she's starting to exhibit these weird behaviors. Starting with the morning, she's supposed to, I don't know, I think there's a scene where she was supposed to like make cereal for herself, and she found herself like eating 3 cans of tuna. Like, oh, like I thought the book was gonna go like, oh, she's gonna drink all the milk because cats like milk. No, she instead eats 3 cans of tuna for her breakfast. And when she finally realizes what she's eating cans of tuna. And then she goes to school, and they're practicing this pretty pivotal part of the musical that they're working on. And she's starting to weird people out. She's licking the backs of her hands, and people are staring at her. And then she has to go climb up this ladder, and she climbs all the way up to the top, and then she sees this urge that she can just jump down, and she jumps down and tries to land on all fours, and when she does, people are like, oh my gosh, she just tried to like kill herself or something, but she's all right, and she's like, something weird is going on. It got to the point where, you know, something feels unnatural to where she has to go find Crystal again and let her know about what's going on with her. So she goes right over to Crystal's house and tries to get Crystal's attention, and she finally interacts with Crystal and says, hey, look, you know, Rip scratched me, all these weird things are happening, he doesn't seem like he can die. And Crystal's like, well, how many times has he died? And she said, well, I think like 3 times. And Crystal's like, oh no, he's died 3 times. Mom's really not gonna like this. and all she wants is answers, but Allison cannot get any answers out of Crystal. Crystal essentially tells her to leave. Allison goes right to Ryan, and she wants to admit to Ryan what's going on, but something compels her to want to go to this cemetery as they're talking and walking nearby for some reason. Like the story just like, oh, by the way, you're having this psychic connection that's guiding you to this pet cemetery. And they end up in this pet cemetery, and they look at the headstones, and they realize that, oh, these must be where the section of the cemetery where the pets are. And then they find the headstone of Rip, and Rip's headstone reads from 1981 to 1993, and since this book was released in early 1998, that means that Rip was dead for 5 years. And Allison kind of puts some pieces of the equation together. Rip died back in like 1993, and since has multiple lives, this must mean that Rip has, you know, come here in between his, you know, lives, right? This must be the place where Rip goes in between the afterlife, and this thing happens in the cemetery where essentially Rip comes out of nowhere and shock scares Allison, and it's really graphic how he comes out of nowhere. It's really gruesome and fun. And of course, Rip shows himself. Not only is he alone, he's not alone. He has this army of other dead cats from the cemetery and these army of cats have formed into a cat tornado. And throughout this mist thing going on in the cemetery, Allison loses her friend Ryan, and she's like, okay, this is beyond weird. We got to go back to Crystal's house. She has to deal with this now. So she goes back to Crystal's house a final time. She manages to get inside before Rip and the cat tornado can catch up. And then Crystal's like, okay, well, maybe my mom can help. You know, Crystal's mom's been out of the equation the whole book. And Crystal's like, fine, I'll take you to see my mom. So they go down to the basement, and this is where a big plot twist happens in the story. Allison meets Crystal's mom for the first time. And Crystal's mom seems to be like a tragic character where she had something really horrific happen to her, dealing with animal experimentation. And there's kind of a bombshell that she reveals that it's very vague, very, very vague, but Crystal's mom essentially says that she was experimenting with cats, and a bunch of cats died. But Rip, for some reason, is a pure evil entity. And when he died, he refused to stay dead. And now, since he's a cat, he's come to claim his 9 lives, and he's died 8 times. And what's happened to her is essentially, I don't want to spoil it, but something dealing with Rip and him coming back from the dead so many times has taken an effect on her where she looks and acts different. And this is pretty sad and harrowing. That's not even the best part about this. So the reveal is that the mom and Crystal are willing to leave Allison for Rip and the cat tornado to do whatever they please with her. So she's been marked. There's this notion that Rip has chosen Allison to be his next victim, essentially. So they leave Allison there, and then she's stuck in this basement with Rip and the cat tornado. And what happens next is that Ryan comes out of nowhere. And tries to help. He breaks up the cat tornado and Rip, and then Allison's like, no, you need to run away, but Ryan insists on staying there. And this is where Ryan also gets scratched by Rip himself, and Rip looks like he takes pleasure in doing this by marking Ryan. And the two are taken back. They don't know what else to do, and something happens where Allison has kept something from early on in the story. I don't want to spoil it, but decides to use it to maybe distract the cats down in the basement. And it may or may not work, which results in something happening pretty significant. And then the ending of the story happens to where this conflict resolution seems to go underway for the whole situation with the Rip and cat tornado thing. And everything seems to be all well until this twist ending happens. And there's some ambiguity saying that maybe the story lives on. And it's kind of sequel baity, but there's a lot of ambiguity dealing especially with the characters of Ryan and Allison, and that's where the story ends. So that essentially is Cry of the Cat, the book. Now, let's start off with the strengths about this book. I don't think I can really give this book enough justice for how well and descriptive this book was, and its prowess was excellent. This book was really descriptive, especially how the story played out. There wasn't really much of an atmosphere other than it was like a school, fall, cold type of read, because the description in the story did make it feel cold, like the grass is freezing when your bare feet touch it. The moonlight shimmers on the water, on like the grass blades. It's very well written in the prowess, and this story just feels more descriptive than your normal Goosebumps book. I feel like Stein really wanted to put you into this dark, cold atmosphere, kind of resembling like fall. That's what I got from the story. Even though it's not outright stated what time of year it is, it's to be kind of implied through the writing, and it made the story much more, I don't know, it made it much more, it made it hit stronger because of how well it was written. That's the best way I can kind of describe it. The premise itself is wild and creepy itself. You have this animal who had a tragic end to his life, but has come back through means alluding to haunting and, you know, mixed with some experimentation notes. Now this cat has some evil, demonic power where he can walk amongst the living, but has the power of the dead, and it's very creepy. This Rip is a very creepy villain. A lot of the stuff that happens to Allison in the story is terrifying, and you know, especially the stuff where she's being suffocated by Rip, and like that scene was really good. Finding the decapitated head, that was really good. You know, him getting smushed, that was told very graphically. The whole thing about Crystal holding the information about her mom, and you know, Allison spiraling, you know, going into the "you gotta believe me, but you gotta believe me done right." That's another thing. Another good thing about this story is that there is "you gotta believe me," but it's done right here. Okay, it was very tense. This whole story was tense. It was creepy. Had the atmosphere going for it. It felt creative. I mean, you know, a lot of things I've heard about the story in the past is that I didn't mention it in the beginning of the video, but this is also playing off The Cat's Tale, which is a short story from Tales Give Me Goosebumps. And that's very prevalent here, except I think that this story was able to add and do some other things to it. The whole cat tornado premise was awesome. Like I said, Rip was awesome. There's a supernatural science fiction element kind of blending together. Everything seemed to work and mesh well. It was very descriptive. It was very, it was actually pretty scary in a lot of these fun scenes here. The cat tornado was wild. And it was fun because of that, especially in that climax with the cat tornado stuff. That was fun. That was really, really fun. Added this weird charm towards the end, where the closest thing that comes to this charming to me is like Piano Lessons Can Be Murder. And it feels like, you know, Piano Lessons Can Be Murder has that weird, like, Asian horror storytelling element going for it. So does this story. This story has that weird Eastern horror vibe to it. And I really dig that. It feels really different for Goosebumps as a whole. I really enjoyed how the climax unfolds. I like how Crystal and Crystal's mom were setting up Allison for failure. This was all great stuff. Even the twist, I like how ambiguous it was. I kind of like how it left some sequel bait, and it felt organic. This book had like literally every single checkbox I could ever want in a book. Minus one. Minus one. And this is my only negative with the book. My only negative with the book. And I've thought about this. And what's preventing me from giving this book a 5 out of 5 is Allison. And I know Allison, you know, I didn't really bash her character that much in the story. A lot of the stuff that this book does is forgiving, or, you know, even some of the, you know, little weird things, it's more forgiving stuff. But for Allison, for me, is a slight negative. And it prevents this book from being perfect. And the reason why is that I think Allison's personality is non-existent in the story. For me, a 5 out of 5 book, in all of my 5 out of 5s, there's some distinct personality or distinct character arc that feels meaningful because of those personalities, because those characters were able to connect to me on an emotional level, right? Allison, though, was not a character that did that for me. Allison, the most we got out of her personality was she was honest with her friend Ryan. She was concerned about her brother's well-being. Even at the end, I didn't mention this in the plot of review, but there is something about this little brother near the end as well. Still kind of touching. And she's a thespian. You don't really see an inner monologue with her character. This story's in the first person. There's really no inner monologue. There's really nothing to go deeper with her character. Her character is very surface level. Everything is superficial and exterior for how it's presented for her character. There's no interior. There's no insight to who she is. It's all about the experiences she faces. And that's really detrimental to this book at the end of the day for me. This book hits every other, like I said, every other box I could want. Every other box. You know, and if I kind of want to be a little nitpicky, I can be a little nitpicky on the vagueness behind the mom's experiments and the whole motives behind that. But I can let a lot slide with that. But I'm not going to be able to let Allison slide on this one. I just, she's holding me back from giving this book a 5 out of 5. So, unfortunately, Allison is a negative. And where I settled with this book, I decided to give this a 4.8 out of 5 and only deduct a 0.2 off for Allison. If she was a bit better, this would have been a home run book. But this is definitely one of the best Goosebumps books I've ever read. It's definitely up there. 4.8s or higher is like really high-hitting books. This is a really good one. Super solid. This is a great one, actually. Highly recommend this if you have never read this. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Cry the Cat, the book. Let me know down in the comment section if you have read this book before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know, and I'll see you next time.